Welcome to Rune Soup, a weekly podcast about magic, culture, and the paranormal. My name is Gordon, and I shall be your host. This week, Dr. Jack Hunter makes his return to the show. Jack is the author and/or editor of Talking with the Spirits, Strange Dimensions, Why People Believe in Spirits, Gods and Magic, Damned Facts, and the recently published Engaging The Anomalous. He joins us for a fascinating chat about spirits, anthropology, ecology, animism, the limits of our modern frames in coming to terms with all these notions, and a surprising detour into the state of permaculture. Enjoy. Dr. Jack, back on the mic. Welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me.
No, yeah, absolutely. Last time you were on, were you officially a doctor then?
No.
No, so that's happened in the intervening, whatever that was, almost 2 years.
Yeah, in the last 2 years. Well, actually, it was only in February.
Oh, there you go.
Graduated.
So I think that officially means you have the hottest name of any guest. There's something, you put a doctor in front of Jack Hunter, which is already quite a cool name. And it's like a computer game character or something, Dr. Jack Hunter.
It is.
So well done. You'd get full marks if you were a girl, because I think Jack is a great name for a girl anyway. But Dr. Jack Hunter, I can see that game or that film. So well done on the PhD and having a cool name.
Thank you very much.
All right, so we had a really cool chat last time, and some of the information that we sort of surfaced has stuck with me, and we were just sort of mentioning before I hit the record button, some of the contributors, I guess, to Damned Facts, a previous book, have appeared in a couple of my presentations in several countries now. But you have a new book, and when we, I guess maybe before we start to talk about it, let's refresh people's memories so that we can open this up. What's ontological flooding?
Okay, so ontological flooding is my idea for a way of approaching, I mean, you could approach fieldwork through ontological flooding or whatever, basically. But it's a framework that places all kind of ontologies, whether we're talking about like scientific materialist ontologies or supernaturalist ontologies or whatever, on a kind of equal playing field. So the idea stemmed from when I was thinking about ontological bracketing, which is the kind of usual approach in the social sciences. If you're investigating religion or the paranormal or anything really, you put ontological brackets around it. So you don't, say you're talking about belief in God, instead of focusing on whether God is real or not and thinking about those kinds of ontological questions, you bracket it out and focus purely on belief, which makes it much easier for social scientists because they don't have to put themselves in the position of, thinking about ontology. So ontological flooding is basically knocking down those barriers, which I sometimes also think of as like, with Charles Fort's idea of damned facts, it's like there's literally some kind of a dam holding back all of these damned facts. So we break down those ontological barriers and let all of these possibilities in, and then you're kind of in a much more, a much more fertile place to be thinking about interesting questions like the nature of spirits and those kinds of things. Instead of bracketing those questions out, we want to engage them head on.
So I have previously described it as the sequence in the original Ghostbusters film where the guy from the EPA shows up and gets them to shut down the containment facility, and New York gets flooded with ghosts towards the end of the second act. And is that what we're talking about? Is that slightly too dramatic? Or if you could do, because if I could do that, I would.
It is like that, but I think it's kind of like a personal kind of subjective shift. So it would be like not wanting to believe that all those ghosts were there, for example, and bracketing them out. But and actually stuff is still going on outside of those brackets, and then you let down those brackets and realize there's this whole vast expanse of weirdness going on, and we don't really understand it yet. So it means that we're opening ourselves up to more creative kind of experimental, exploratory investigations.
And when you're talking about having multiple ontologies in the flood, we're talking specifically, I guess, in an anthropological context, we're talking about, non-Western or even, I guess, non-empirical, because they can in fact be Western, ontologies and ways of truth validation. And I guess something that really leapt out at me in the latest book, in Engaging the Anomalous, is we regularly go into detail in the show about psi results. So I had Dr. Radin on talking about his new book, Real Magic, quite recently. Yeah. And in that discussion and in the book, he makes the contentious, but I think nevertheless true observation that the empirical method hasn't quite got us across the line. It's got us to the line, but hasn't quite got us across the line on the reality of certain phenomena, however problematic. We're going to leave that word reality as it is. Life after death, spirits, and so on. And I don't think it ever can get us there. I think it leads us right up to the door, but it's almost by definition, empiricism can't walk us through because of what it's for. It's not for that. And well, I've had this discussion with Dr. Radin. I had this discussion with Alex from Skeptico. I think at that point, you kind of need to barrel roll into anthropology or something like it, because there are other modes of truth validation and like referencing Dr. Kreipel and comparison and so on. What kind of insights then might, I guess, modern anthropology yield if we're at that doorway and we want to do the barrel roll?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's actually something that I've been thinking about a lot recently, because I don't know whether you know, but I know that you're interested in permaculture now, but I've been working on a permaculture project now for the past couple of years with a school in our local area. And actually this came up in a conversation I had with Dr. Andy Letcher the other day on the podcast that we're doing for that. But the question that I asked Andy was, how can we show young Western kids that there are other ways of living in, experiencing and interacting with the world? Because one of the things that I'm trying to think about is how we might be able to teach young kids about things like animist worldviews and Gaia hypothesis and all of these different kinds of really interesting ways of thinking about our relationship with the world. How can we translate that across to young kids who are really thoroughly invested in mainstream Western culture, really? So I think anthropology gives a really, it's a robust, time-tested method of teaching people about other worlds, really. So that I think anthropology is in a really good place to offer new suggestions for science going forwards. It shows us that there are other ways of living in the world that are equally as rich and complex as any Western ontology, really. And actually, when we look at it, some of those other ways of living in and interacting with the world might actually be, it's a weird thing to say, but they might actually be better, or they might actually be more well suited to living, I don't want to say correctly, but living in tune with everything.
Bringing the human and more than human into alignment. I've also stumbled over, you don't want to say correctly or better. Yeah, I know. That's the other line you hit where it's like, well, this isn't right. Like, this is unsatisfactory. But how do I describe that exploration without just layering values that, in particular with anthropology, don't have a very good history. So noble savage ideas and that kind of thing. But speaking of, let me run this by you and let me know what you think. I think one of the reasons anthropology is the next step for a lot of these fields, and we'll come back to permaculture because I have things to say on it, but something like parapsychology is because anthropology is a little bit further ahead in interrogating the skeletons in its closet, of which there are many, and in some cases literal skeletons, which probably need to be returned, right? But I think it's a little bit further ahead in in that kind of dark night of the soul moment of, well, hang on, how are we generating truth here? And it's kind of done that interrogation. So even if at the end of the process it turns out there's nothing that anthropology can say to parapsychology, which is unlikely. At the very least, there is a few decades, 25, 30 years maybe, of just looking at its own model to see where its shortcomings are. Do you think that maybe is part of where a growing number of people are perceiving the value in where, I guess, modern anthropology is for the kind of wider philosophical questions?
Yeah, it's kind of like anthropology is had to become much more reflexive. It's had to think about what it's doing. So, I guess in the 19th century when the discipline first emerged, they were kind of pretty gung-ho about it, and they were steadfast in their view that their ontology was the dominant ontology. And they just went out into the field. They collected data in a haphazard way. They didn't think about any kinds of consequences of their actions. Basically plundering sacred objects and things and taking them off to places like Oxford, to put them in the museum and things like that. But over time, I think, and really what I think it is actually part of the process, I think, is a similar kind of ontological flooding that they realize through interacting with people on a personal one-to-one level instead of trying to maintain this objective distance. And that's one thing about anthropology. It's slowly moved towards this kind of breaking down the idea of objectivity. We can't just go into another world and assume that we're somehow separate from it and that our presence there isn't going to have all sorts of different kinds of ramifications and implications and things. That's just not how things are.
Well, objectivity is a premise, is an enlightenment premise that they bring with them. So you kind of ruin yourself before you've begun if that's something you intend to attempt to adhere to, I guess.
Exactly, and that's what why we've moved beyond the early kind of like James Fraser and E.B. Tyler and those kinds of guys. We moved through ethnography into this much more reflexive way of thinking, of realizing that we are as much a part of the system as anyone else.
So that's where I think where it's further ahead than something like parapsychology, because I mean this is at least in part building, which is in the book, in building on DiMartino's observation that psi in the lab, for instance, and I get what parapsychology is trying to do. It's kind of like fighting its own battle, but it's bringing some premises with it as well that I think Dr. Radin is beginning a long and hopefully successful journey to at least shift someone. But that observation was that if you're doing psi in the lab, you miss the embedded cultural and personal and environmental meaning in, I guess, anomalous events, and especially so when it comes to things like after-death contact, because it's a very different experience if your parent dies and they're on the other side of the country and you're sort of woken up by this apparition of your parents at the time of their death in your bedroom and what have you. That's a different kind of event to demonstrating telepathy, right?
Yeah, very different. It's just I mean, the whole thing is completely different. That all of the, like, if you want to think just about the kind of the body and the, your physiological arousal and the neurochemicals and all of that is different. Not to mention the emotional side of things, the context that you're in your own home, waking from sleep, all those kinds of things. Very difficult to replicate that in the lab. And I have been reading Dean's book, and I think he is moving in that direction, of realizing that we need to start thinking about psi in the real world, how psi is actually embedded into, nature, really.
And that's, as far as I'm concerned, that's best practice anthropology. That's sort of what I said to Alex. It's we actually, conveniently, here's one I prepared earlier, do in fact have this reasonably robust I guess, epistemology or at least mode of analysis that's already been through a pretty good dark night of the soul and examined its own shortcomings, at the good bit of it. Like, it's a broad church, and it's just nevertheless convenient that we have one, right? And I just sort of have this notion that at the beginning of, well, wherever we are now, I guess 20% of the way through the 21st century, the only, I guess, school of philosophy, if you will, that interests me is anthropology. I don't think anything else is sufficiently haunted, so flooded, and I don't think anything else has been through the same dark night of the soul. And it's one of those mysterious things that appears at the right time.
Yeah, it is. It's definitely an interesting discipline. It's interesting for lots of reasons, though. It's interesting because of like you said, because of the epistemology and how you go about building up knowledge. But it's also interesting in what it reveals as well. And actually, the two are kind of fundamentally interconnected. It's a really cool thing.
So let me talk about permaculture and how I think it's another one of those. And this, I guess, comes back to the sort of Fort model of sort of reaching the end of the utility of a previous dominant, right? So permaculture is going through something that magic goes through. I listen to a bunch of podcasts, and there's some quite good ones out there sort of interrogating a lot of its foundational premises that came from Bill Mollison and so on. And it's weird. It's like it's a design science without any design theory for a start. And that's a big one for them. But they're at the philosophical point where if we're looking for whole systems context, why are we focusing on this sort of 11-step procedure that we kind of apply? And especially at a local level, or I guess a domestic level, it's a 25-step procedure. And the long-running joke is you're not doing permaculture unless you have like a cob pizza oven in your yard. And they've hit this point, and it's because if you look at the actual journey of permaculture, like Bill had things that he needed it to do, and it does some of those things. So it was almost like the practice arrived before the theory, and now they're at this point, and it's really interesting to watch them go round and round into almost a factionalism, because it's do you stick close to the Goetia of Mollison, which is what I call his permaculture book, Permaculture Designer Manual. Or do you recognize that it does, in fact, need to evolve? Because the pieces are in there. He traveled the world and knew that New Guinean gardeners were better at an energy in, energy out management of their kind of agricultural systems. But nevertheless, we're stuck with this sort of launch code that does modify depending on your environment, but is there. And if you listen to people's soul search around it, they're tempted to throw the whole thing out, and I think it needs to be flooded. I also think his focus on materialism, and I get why, because he's dealing with a lot of hippy-dippy people, and he really does need them to dig swales. But I think it's hit that same dark night of the soul, or not dark night of the soul. It's hit the edge of what that worldview can offer until you flood it, because there are things that happen engaging with the more than human world that aren't described within that system. It's a very Charles Fort tension point. I don't know if that's been your experience.
It's really interesting that you're bringing that up, because one of the things I'm becoming interested in now is through over the last couple of years interacting with permaculture people and talking to people who've been involved in permaculture for a long time, and not even permaculture specifically, but also kind of like environmental education and things like that. And I'm starting to notice these little things bubbling up, like again, for this podcast that I've been doing for the past few weeks, we did an interview with a guy called Steve Pickup, who was into permaculture. He's been into permaculture for a long time, but his job now is growing willow. And we were asking him about how he came to have a business that is growing willow and selling these willow dome kits and things. And one of the most interesting thing he said, and he only said it kind of like as a little side note, was that somehow it's like the willow found me. So I'm starting to see these interesting things popping up where through permaculture practices, people are beginning to engage with the natural world around them, and then the natural world seems to be coming back at them. And this is,
I love it.
Yeah.
And what I think anthropology and something like, say, for its flaws, I still quite like it. Perspectivism, for instance. What I think anthropology can teach or at least give to permaculture is there isn't yet a framework in those kind of design steps for going, no, this is legitimate. Like Willow could have found you. This is a fundamentally legitimate way of thinking with the more than human world. And that's where the tension point is. So we've had Lynn McTaggart on the show talking about her intention exercises. And over the last 10 years, she's done them where the kind of classic sci stuff where you get a group of people intending to grow barley faster, and of course it works, and the implications for that, if you are the human in your system, which I am now, the implications for that in permaculture, this is more or less verified stuff. And how do you think with that? Like, how do you have that and Willow found me as valid, not just valid statements, but actual valid positions on which to kind of further your interaction? And as far as I can tell, the only place we find that is the good parts of anthropology. Yeah,
definitely. There's definitely interesting kind of like fertile new spaces opening up for dialogues between permaculture and anthropology, for example. I'm also thinking of the intersections between permaculture and kind of like religious education in schools and things like that. There's mutually beneficial relationship waiting to happen between these disciplines that explore different world views, different cosmologies and things, and permaculture, which you're right is rooted in it's rooted in the material world, isn't it? It's a really
and that was, I mean, Bill made no bones about it, right? Like it attracts people who are probably more mystically inclined, whatever word you want for that, right? It definitely attracts people who are more that, but he never said anything other than, and I'm describing it using marketing terms, but basically he built permaculture as a method of privately funding aid projects in the developing world by selling a gardening information product in the developed one. And he wasn't even a scam. Like, he would tell people that, right? So he had this hyper fixation on, and rightly so, on the material improvements that he could bring and fund. And nevertheless, if you embark on this journey, and I guess on the more mystic side, you have the kind of Holmgren approach to it. And he's certainly incorporated, I mean, he's been doing yoga for decades and so on. So he's certainly incorporated the interpersonal and transpersonal and I guess more than human in it. It just seems it's at this point, very Fortean point, where it's decohering, and it needs to decohere because there are other parts or other lines that I guess need to inform it. And I'm really glad that I didn't expect, because there's no permaculture in your book, Jack. I didn't expect we'd be talking about this, but I'm loving it.
Yeah, well, the book is actually, I'm thinking about this book because it's kind of like a lot of the essays in there I've written alongside my thesis. So it's kind of like a version of my thesis in a way. And I'm thinking of it kind of like wrapping up that phase of my work. And then I seem to be moving in this direction. There's really clear overlaps between the book about how we interact with spirits and all of the kinds of processes involved with that interaction. And now I'm thinking about how that relates to ecology and the environment and permaculture. So although the book is not related to permaculture, it's kind of like the groundwork for how I'm coming at permaculture now.
Yeah, it sort of, I loved it. It bellows breathes validity into different modes of spirit interaction and experiences of the more than human world, which I have a question here, and it is my, what's the word I'm looking for? I don't want to say it's a pain point, but it's where Alex from Skeptico and I disagree on this. So parapsychologists seem to want to replace positive materialism, which is a good thing to do, with idealism. And anthropologists want to replace it with animism. as far as I can tell. And I'm team animism, so that's fine. But if we take this notion from, say, Hallowell, mid-20th century, through Bird David, and end up post Viveros de Castro with what we see is the rise and rise of personhood and then perspectivism. And this is all good. And we've had a bunch of shows talking about the extension of personhood in that Harvey sense, the extension of personhood beyond the human. Do you think this kind of animist position, the fifth turning, do you think it is sufficiently flooded yet?
That is a good question. I've been thinking a lot about animism recently. In fact, I'm always thinking about animism. But I don't know whether this is going to answer the question, but this is kind of what I've been thinking about. So when we look at the kind of the worldview that emerges from anomalistics, so from all of the study of, in all of its varied guises, from like cryptozoology and researching Bigfoot and all those kinds of things, all the way through to, paranthropology and parapsychology investigating psi, and then the ghost researchers investigating ghosts. When we move all of these things together, what we seem to come out with at the end of it is exactly that, like what anthropologists have called an animist worldview. And one of the things that I've been thinking about recently is how we can kind of, have you heard of like these ideas of like the greening of religion and things like that?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Whether we can do a kind of like a greening of the paranormal and use all of that, because the worldview that emerges is an animistic worldview. And then when you come to applying an animistic worldview to the actual world, then you start to realize how fundamentally wrong our other way of thinking has been. And yeah, go on.
Well, that is one of the things we were talking about before we hit the record button is Amber J. Seppi's, or CP, I actually don't know how to pronounce her name, in Damn Facts. And she basically makes a point, which I've made, but she described it better, which is it's nevertheless interesting that every other culture around the world at all points in time, and including our own really prior to the Enlightenment, you can squint down and see some, and it's a dangerous word, but I'm going to use it. You can squint down and see some universals, like personhood beyond the human, and so on. And this is where I think the greening of parapsychology needs to happen, and I think anthropology can do it, because I know they like idealism, but when I look at that, I see it as another continuation of their 19th century foundational premises, because that was essentially the question in the 19th century. Is it materialism, or is it this Orientalist white person version of Hinduism that we got from our colony? And I know that's a bit mean, but this is where anthropology is, I think, further ahead. And if you look at animism versus idealism, animism can be, as far as I can tell, it's an epistemology that can swallow the entire universe without anything touching the sides. With idealism, it can't. Like, it is the anomalous stuff is still a bit weird, and it still hits the sides, and you still have to kind of go, well, maybe the Fatima miracle was like a delusion, or maybe because everything's kind of all the one mind, maybe you're not seeing it correctly, and it has this dissociative or medicalized view of the universe, which surprises me. Like, why would the universe build itself broken? Like, I think that's a valid philosophical question. And animism can absorb post-materialism in all its forms. So it can absorb parapsychology, and it can absorb best practice ecology, and all the rest of it in a way that I just can't, and I've tried, I can't get idealism to do. So for me, I think it's almost like you, and I did this, by the way, it's almost like you Goldilocks your way along until you find the one that is the best match for your own lived experience and the data. And I think it's animism. I'm prepared to be wrong on this. So when Alex listens to this, I'm prepared to be wrong on this, but I don't think at the moment I am.
I think that's a really interesting point. I like the idea that animism can subsume all of these disparate kinds of approaches and perspectives as well. It's really cool. But yeah, I think you're right. When we look at, I mean, again, it's when we start to interact with the world around us, animism almost becomes like obvious.
Yeah.
I mean, we're seeing like fish using tools in the sea and things. It's only through interacting with fish, on that one-to-one basis, which we hadn't been able to do because, technology or whatever. It's only through interacting and spending time with them that you begin to see these personhood traits coming through. And it's really only because no one's ever actually looked before. Well, obviously some people have, but like from a mainstream science perspective, no one's looked for that. No one's spent the time interacting with stick insects to find their, to make that connection. I'm sure people have, but it doesn't come through. But the thing that's not coming through is animism. It's like we need to interact with the world more. And when we do that, we'll realize that this animistic worldview makes a lot of sense.
It does, and I also have, and this is just personal, what's the word I'm looking for here? This is just a thing I like. It is not part of my polemic trying to demonstrate that I think this is the least worst, because they're all kind of wrong, I guess, in a way, I don't know. Least worst kind of macro epistemology. It's from a esoteric perspective, going back to Egypt, but then also kind of really kicking off with the Renaissance. There is a notion that there is an original belief system on the planet from which we have fallen away. And you can trace the historic origins of that idea clearly, so that it's not like there is, in fact, a survived or declined wisdom that's handed down through masters over many millennia, right? That's not correct. But there's this, it just feels right. It feels like we used to kind of have this, we used to know this better. We used to interact better. It feels like the world is a bit broken or fallen. And nevertheless, and what is the original, as far as we can tell archaeologically, what is the original belief system on the planet? And I put those two ideas together. It doesn't mean anything, right? But from a esoteric perspective, if you were looking for that sort of Prisca Theologia, it's animism.
Yeah, but I think it goes even deeper, because we're talking about belief systems there, but I think it goes deeper, and actually animism, I think it rises, I don't know, maybe it's fundamental, but how we're related to everything going right back to, the beginning of the universe, basically, how we're all actually a part of it.
Yep.
I think that's the deeper level that we need to go to. It's not like we can go back in the archaeological record and find the evidence of the earliest religion or the earliest animism or the earliest belief system, because it's a continuous thing that goes all the way back to the very beginning of the universe.
Yeah, I think that's...
But that's the fun, like at that point, at that oneness with the universe, that's the ultimate animism, where we are one with the other. Do you see what I mean?
Oh, absolutely.
It's a primordial. It's more primordial than archaeology can get to.
It is. I think archaeology can get us to a point where we can dig up the remains of cultures for which that notion is self-evident. And I guess that's sort of what I mean. But it also kind of brings me back to the original question of, do you think, even though animism, even though anthropology is playing a blinder, frankly, over the last couple of decades, going back to whether you think it's sufficiently flooded. Now, in Engaging the Anomalous, you reference Edith Turner's work in Zambia a number of times. Now, she may well be an example of sufficiently flooded, but for people who are maybe unfamiliar, just kind of describe a bit about that.
So a bit about Edith Turner.
Yeah.
Well, I was really lucky when I went to Esalen a few years ago. Edith Turner was actually there. We invited her along, and she came along, and she was 92 at the time. And sadly, she passed away the year before last. But I mean, she was very old, but she was very lovely, and she's just the most incredible. She's been a massive inspiration for me, really. She's a really incredible anthropologist. She was married to Victor Turner, who in anthropology, Victor Turner's about as big a name as you can get. You know, he's a granddaddy of anthropology. And then Edith Turner, you know, she was there with him as he was doing his fieldwork, so she was as much a part of all of that as he was, in a sense. But it was only really after Victor Turner passed away that Edie started to kind of, you know, to make her own ideas and writings public. And one of the most interesting things she did, she'd been to this ceremony with the Ndembu in Zambia with Victor Turner, you know, earlier on, and they'd participated in this ritual, but they hadn't allowed themselves, you know, they were still trying to maintain a sense of objectivity, basically. And they'd observed this Ihamba ceremony, which is where a spirit's extracted from the body of an afflicted patient, and then it's kind of capped and put away in like a jar. And they'd observed it, but they hadn't allowed themselves to get fully immersed in it. And then years later, Edie went back to Zambia to participate in the same ritual again, but this time she allowed herself to, she let her ontological flood barriers down and allowed herself to kind of move with the flow of the whole thing. And, you know, she was clapping along and dancing along and, you know, crying and emotions welling up and all these kinds of things, which I think are all, you know, we know pretty much that all of these kinds of things, physiological arousal and all of that, high emotions are related to, you know, bigger psi kind of phenomena or bigger extraordinary experiences. So it was all building up. And at the climax of the experience, she saw this ectoplasmic, she described it as a grey plasma kind of blob, which was the Ihamba spirit itself, extracted from the back of the patient. And other people there saw it as well, the rest of the people participating in the ritual. And they capped it in the jar, covered it over with a castor leaf. And when they went to look inside the jar to see the spirit, it turned into a human tooth. So the idea is that this spirit and the tooth are the same thing, and the tooth kind of travels around inside the body as the spirit, and obviously it needs to be taken out. So she kind of allowed herself to be ontologic, to let down her ontological flood barriers and allow this experience to make itself known to her. And that's where she came up with this idea that anthropologists need to learn to see how the natives see. So we need to learn to be able to allow ourselves to let down our flood barriers enough to allow ourselves to see the things that other people see. And I think that was a really, really influential idea for me, that especially with my fieldwork with mediums, that I needed to allow myself to experience what they experience. And it is not easy. And it, especially when you're talking about seances and things, like your first initial thoughts about it are that it's going to be scary, and you've been brought up to think that it's kind of like, maybe even evil or a little bit, quite bad, really. So you have to get rid of all of that stuff and allow yourself to really get into it. And what I found was most interesting was that when I did allow myself to go with the flow, then I did also have some weird experiences. So yeah, Edith Turner, her approach is really amazing, really.
There's a quotation in the book from her, which basically it's almost kind of Jungian, which essentially after going through that experience and seeing the spirit being taken out of the patient's back and so on, she said, "Yep, it's spirits. Like as anthropologists, we need to work out, I saw that stuff. We need to work out how we talk about it, because there's no this is their belief system and this is ours. It's like, no, that's a thing that happened." Was she was she still there at 92? Yeah.
Oh wow, yes. Well, she was. She was amazing. It was really cool because in the kind of meeting, when we gave our presentations, we had Edith Turner sitting on one side of us and Stanley Krippner sitting on the other side, because they needed to be able to hear what we were saying, so they were leaning in. But when Edie was talking, she was like an oracle. I always think that she was like an oracle when I think back to it. The stuff she was saying was kind of like I don't know, it was almost kind of like glowing, and everyone loved it. Everyone was so happy when she was talking. It was amazing. I don't know how to describe it, but yeah, she was definitely there, and she definitely seemed to be, exuding some kind of energy, I suppose.
Do you think she was broadly optimistic? Because at the time, I mean, from memory, I wish I had it in front of me. The quotation was from 93, but that sounds too late. Nevertheless, do you think she's broadly optimistic? Because at the time, she would have been swimming against the tide somewhat by going, like, actually, we need new frames to, as professionals, we need new frames when we're doing this kind of work, because these phenomena, whatever they are, have a reality.
Yeah, she was optimistic, but, you need that kind of optimism. You need someone to be brave enough to put forward the idea in the first place. I mean,
and it could have been, it could have been a lot earlier. Another thing I found, and I like him even less now, but in the book I found out that Tyler also attended seances, and he appeared to be convinced something was going on. And this is the guy that gave us the term animism, and in a not exactly racially friendly way. And I didn't. So did you know before you did your sort of spiritualism field work that the kind of founder of this sort of field had also done the same thing?
I stumbled across it as I was doing my field work. So obviously I was researching, like academic researching alongside field work as well. But when I found it, I was like, well, it's incredible that, anthropologists have been actively engaging with these things since the very dawn of the discipline. I mean, for all Tyler's misgivings and things, at least he was taking it seriously enough to attend seances and to actually think about it. And the worst thing about it is obviously that he, in his public writings, he didn't make any mention of the fact that he also had these kinds of experiences. And
why do you think that was?
Well, it's weird because a lot of those early anthropologists were kind of anti-religion. And really what they wanted to do was to get rid of religion in the West and replace it with science. So I think the fact that he had those experiences himself, it was kind of like evidence against his overall theory. And he couldn't, you can't present contrary evidence. Well, you couldn't in those times.
You're more forgiving of him than I am then, because I think that there's an intellectual bravery in it. I get, so I have the same problem with Freud, which is he was doing telepathy experiments with his daughter and so on. So he has this public face about it. And then in private, he's aware that there's a reality behind these phenomena. And the only justification I've heard is that he's trying to get psychoanalysis to be treated credibly as a legitimate discipline. And Tyler might be the same, but in both cases, I don't know. I'm less forgiving of them, I think.
No, what I'm trying to say is I appreciate their bravery, their private bravery of actually going and doing the research themselves, but it's intellectually, what's the word? It's not good.
It's cowardly, but also we're left with their mess. We'd be 100 years ahead of where we are now.
Exactly. Yeah. So, but this is what I'm saying. Like, Tyler was motivated to try and bring down religion to some extent. He was trying to show that religion was also a part of this animist belief, which is all basically nonsense. So, I mean, that's not a good thing. That's not necessarily a good thing to be trying to do.
No, probably not.
Not really. So, there's bad things and there's good things. He was good to go to see the seances, to participate in them and to have those experiences, but he was bad not to share that data, because that data kind of contradicted his agenda.
And was it just passing comments, or did you find actual, I went on this date and these things happened, and that turned out to be an accurate description of somebody's great aunt or whatever?
I can't remember specifically what happened. He saw table wraps and things, and he sat in kind of like trance channeling sessions with Stanton Moses, and it's interesting. All of these reports, they were unpublished by Tyler. They were just in his kind of like private diaries and letters, and it was a historian of anthropology called George Stocking in the 70s who published this piece. So we only have kind of like little snapshots of his experiences, but he does say that we have in his private writings that we have to stay open to the possibility that there actually is some kind of a psychic force, because he couldn't explain the things that he'd seen. So there's these little snapshots of his experiences in there. It's just a shame that he didn't expand on it into a full piece.
Yeah. Is that common? Is the invisible college still in effect? Is that is that where we begin the flood, do you think? Because not that it is as dire and awful as it was in 150 years ago, but
yeah,
is that still common as far as you can tell?
That people have these experiences.
Specifically, anthropologists have. So there's two discussions. There's a discussion which is how do we do this research? How do we publish and critique this research or this field work or whatever it happens to be? So that's discussion one. The other one is kind of a bit more closer to Edith Turner. Like, by the way, when I was in Zambia, I saw a guy levitate 15 feet. Does that still go on?
Yeah, it does. There are different degrees to which people are willing to kind of talk about these things. A lot of anthropologists still would be unlikely to want to associate themselves with the paranormal, for example, because of they don't want to damage their careers. And maybe I've damaged my career already by getting this involved in it. I'm not sure.
Well, you did have a whole chapter about that in the book.
Yeah. So we'll see. But yeah, there are still taboos. And Edith Turner was writing about these taboos, 20, 30 years ago. People have been writing about them for a long time, and I don't think they're going to go away really quickly. There's just these pockets of people who are exploring them. And I guess we kind of like interact with those people that we can interact with. Whereas the mainstream, the big daddies and things of anthropology and big mummies, they're not thinking about these things at all. They're not necessarily concerned with them, or they've thought about them and then they've moved on to other more important things or more respectable things.
Probably more respectable. So the flood begins with the invisible college. Then is that how it? I mean, I'm just trying to work out what that is from next steps. I guess it's a case of having a building conspiracy of people sharing this stuff.
Well, exactly, and that's why I started Paranthropology in the first place, was to provide a platform where these kinds of things can be explicitly talked about. And I know there were other journals like the Anthropology of Consciousness and things around, but again, like they seem to have moved towards the more respectable. Do you see what I mean? They've moved towards the Anthropology of Consciousness, not the Anthropology of the Paranormal.
No, they slide into the kind of perfectly safe. God save me from panpsychism, but they slide into that perfectly safe middle of the road reality sandwich stuff, and you're a bit more literally Fortean in the Charles Fort sense, which I very much resonate with, which is the damned facts. It's the anomalous stuff that falls outside of the dominant that should interest us the most, because that's how we interrogate the edges of it.
Yeah, exactly.
I learned a few more things about your Bristol Spirit Lodge experience in this book that I didn't otherwise know. So speculate, and this is speculation, obviously, as to why some of the spirits may have needed full blackout conditions. Did they explain why they needed it? Because some of them didn't. It was interesting to hear, and I think valid and good, that the group that was sitting would try to make it as, light and fraud-free as possible. That's an indication you've got a dedicated group and a diligent group, I guess. But,
Yeah.
why do some spirits need full blackout conditions?
That's a good question.
Right?
I think from my experience, the main reason was those spirits that would talk through full blackout were attempting to manifest in the room. So they were attempting to make, like, as in physical mediumship, ectoplasm style. They were attempting to make themselves physically manifest in the room. Whereas the red light conditions, I mean, most of the mediums in those situations were just trance channeling.
But so why do photons impact manifestation?
Well, that's another good question.
Yeah. But it's interesting because this is I think this is an example of the things that we can squint down to and say that there are some universals here that we can look at. And so, again, it's speculating. Have a bash at it.
Okay. Well, we know, from the history of ectoplasm research, I'm going to talk a little bit about ectoplasm.
Go for it.
Yeah. We know from the history of ectoplasm research that people or researchers have always noted that it was supposed to be photosensitive, that it's actually dangerous for the ectoplasm to come in contact with, with photons, with light, and it can kind of snap back and injure the medium themselves, which is, most mediums probably wouldn't want that to happen. The other side of the darkness as well is that I think the darkness, as well as allowing for the possibility of fraud, which I don't want to rule out, and I actually think that fraud and, performative aspects are fundamental to thinking about mediumship as well.
Sure.
But as well as allowing for the possibility of that, which itself might might enable genuine psi phenomena, the darkness also puts the rest of the sitters into a kind of an altered state of consciousness. It's like sensory deprivation.
See,
and I'm guessing,
that would have been where I'm thinking, because I also was unaware, although it's probably just something that's left in my head. You describe in one of the chapters that these sessions would go for several hours. So you got the first hour where people are just kind of sitting there listening to the music, getting in the zone, while the trance mediums are trying to, open up to their spirit team. So that's fascinating from a ritual magic perspective, that you have a multi-hour session of gradually changing consciousness, including parts where it's full blackout. Now, I've done, I don't know if you have, but I've done, float tanks and that kind of stuff. And it gets pretty crazy after the first hour of complete blackness. In a good sense, It gets, you are definitely in a state where other things can happen. And I'm just wondering, that's kind of where that was my guess. That was my speculation.
Yeah. Well, that's it. But I think it's all of these different factors are related. So the possibility of fraud, the kind of uncertainty about what's going on. It's like ontological flooding again. It's a way of getting out of your comfort zone and entering into a space where uncertainty takes over and where new possibilities arise. So it's about getting yourself into an altered state of consciousness, but also an altered way of thinking.
And I think it's an important one. It stuck out to me because I think it's a good example of one of those universals that, again, a challenging word, I'm going with it, one of those universals that you can find described in other times and places and cultures to do with spirit contact and the night and darkness. It's a universal, right? And it's fascinating to me. Those are the pieces that I think anthropology can kind of throw over the fence into where parapsychology is at, going you guys are doing these, xenocard experiments or whatever and trying out telepathy in the dark. We do happen to have quite a number of cultures around the world that require it for ancestral spirit contact or whatever it happens to be.
Yeah. I also just popped into my mind then as well. I also like the idea that parapsychologists themselves are inadvertently Like, they don't know necessarily why it is that they're doing these things, but they're developing their experimental methods, and they're moving closer and closer and closer to traditional practices.
Yes,
like they realize
100%.
Yeah. So they're perhaps in 100 years or so, another 100 years, parapsychology will look exactly the same as like some kind of shamanic tradition, or
I can't escape the sensation that somebody on the other side's building a Stargate effectively. Do you know what I mean? Like they are moving in that direction, and
slowly getting there.
Well, here's the thing: in aggregate, there's some really good pieces, and the darkness is one of them. But you also mentioned, for instance, Patrick Giesler's results using. So he found. Obviously, you're going to get, when you're doing a telepathy experiment, you're going to get, well, hopefully, you're going to get above chance results. And so, but he noticed you get better results if you use culturally significant symbols than if you just use a random number generator and get people to sort of guess it's a 7. Now, that is a unit, that's like another thread to pull on. That's the same thing with the darkness, where you can kind of, you start to build ritual technology, for one of a less dramatic term, I suppose. So I agree. I think they already have the pieces. It's like the spaceship just needs to be assembled.
Yeah, exactly. They got all the parts. Just need to put them back together.
And is that how to describe this? Is there also a attitude to the material that might be useful? So, I mean, talk us through, for instance, Susan Greenwood's notion of magical consciousness, because that is 2/3 flooded, maybe, but it could be useful for something like parapsychology.
Yeah. Well, what Susan Greenwood's talking about is, again, it's a way of thinking about the world. Okay, she's talking about basically it's a cognitive state. I think she also thinks that there are neurophysiological correlates and things as well with magical thinking. That you could do. In fact, she has written a book on a neuroscience of kind of magic, which is really interesting. But yeah, I think you're right. It might be 2/3 flooded. It's almost there.
I think if people lived there for a few years, I think if people did magical consciousness, it's kind of like the spaceship building itself. You'll quickly realize you'll hit the walls of the dominant, but you'll get there faster if you use magical consciousness.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it takes you again. It takes you so far, and then you have to take another leap. It's the same with a lot of the approaches in anthropology. Over time, they gradually push the door a little bit further along, and eventually, there comes a point where we have to break through that door and go into whatever is next. There was one of the interesting things that came out of my my viva when I finished my thesis, my PhD. My examiners were Ronald Hutton and Angela Voss, so I had really good, nice examiners. But their suggestion was that my thesis kind of like laid the groundworks for moving on to the next stage, and we had a chat about what that next next stage might be, and they suggested that perhaps some kind of like a metaphysical anthropology is where we have to go next, which is a really interesting idea that you could have like a metaphysical anthropology, and I'm just trying to think through that now, what it would be.
Is that term just going to repeat the mistakes of using paranormal and supernatural and so on in the 19th century? Because I know what you're all talking about.
Yeah, I know it's not an easy. There's no. We're trying to think of how we could frame it, because I'd thought of other terms before. There are terms like post-secular anthropology and all these different ones, and really they're all talking about kind of the same thing. It's just it hasn't kind of crystallized yet. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah. I just think it needs. It needs a barrel roll, because paranormal's besides super is above, meta is above. I think you just need to go. Do you know what? Fuck yeah. It's animist anthropology. That's what it is. That's what it is. Or just animism. And that's where you can be a doctor of animism, Jack.
Yeah. The ecological context might be where it is.
I think so.
Yeah. The metaphysic, we need to change what we mean by metaphysics.
Well, because they still have materialism in it. So metaphysic there's still an emphasis on the physical, right? Same thing with normal and natural. If you put para and super and so on, leaving aside the fact that natural is, as you're very aware, nature is an enlightenment concept in and of itself. So, this is a really challenging conversation because we're trying to. The whole point is that we don't have the right words for it.
Yeah, it doesn't exist yet.
Yeah, you feel it though. Like, this is what I really, really enjoyed about the book, and I'm glad you did put it together because, as you say, it feels like, not that I've read your thesis. I'm sure it's very good. But there's also a kind of intellectual journey in because it's about 8 years worth of different essays and interviews and so on. And I know what you mean by it not being the end, I'm done talking about this. But it does feel like a coherent, I needed to work through this, and now here we are, and it needs to incorporate the more than human in a biosphere sense and a spirit sense, and it needs to be able to weave these things together. And I do get that impression in the kind of journey of the book.
That's good, because that's where we're at.
Nice one. God, if I'd known about the permaculture stuff, I would have made you do 2 episodes. So with this one done... Oh, go on.
It's okay. You carry on.
Well, with this book done, which is great, and obviously the links are in the show notes and so on, what else you got going on, Dr. Jack? If we're moving into that world, where can people find you and tell us what's happening?
Well, one of the things I'm kind of most kind of fully engaged with at the moment is this permaculture project that I've been working on. Mm-hmm. So we've been putting together we've done 5 episodes of a podcast. They're only half-hour episodes, and we're saying the purpose of the podcast is to explore the fertile edges of permaculture, ecology, and education. But our project is an education project. We're trying to somehow weave a kind of permaculture approach into a kind of mainstream school curriculum, which is actually really difficult. Yeah. But this podcast that we're doing is our way of exploring these ideas. So we've been interviewing people, we interviewed Andy Letcher the other day about his new MA at the Schumacher College on ecology and spirituality. We talked to people about... we talked to a theologian who works at the cathedral in Chester about her approach, and she's a really interesting character, Claire Henderson Davis. I think, these discussions that I'm having on my paranormal side of things and the discussions that I'm having on my permaculture side of things are all merging together. A kind of continuation of these discussions that we're having, I'd suggest that you check out our One School, One Planet podcast as well, because there's a lot of overlaps.
Oh, well, I certainly will, and it'll be in the show notes. I don't even know if it's a lot of overlaps. I agree with, this is where I'm at, right? It's the same. This is the trouble why metaphysic doesn't work and so on. It's the same. It needs to be the same. Ontology, epistemology. It needs to be the same set of tools and life ways to incorporate and engage with the biosphere and spirits and so on. And this is exciting. I did not know that this is where that conversation would end. And as soon as I've hit the stop button, I'm going to go download some podcasts.
Cool.
Nice one. Great. So other than that, what other websites, any other places people can reach out to you or so on? Do you tweet, Dr. Jack?
I don't tweet, no. There's all of the Facebook Anthropology groups that are still up there for people to have discussions and post interesting stuff. And I've got my own kind of personal website, which is, it's like my online CV, but I upload all the podcasts I do onto there, and videos and various things, and that's at jack-hunter.webstarts.com.
Gotcha.
So
and does that have the academia stuff as well?
It does. It's got everything.
Awesome. That will be in the show notes. Well, congratulations on the book. I devoured it. I thought it was a fascinating read. And thank you for like a really surprising turn, our own anthropological turn in this conversation, because I'm very much here for that. That mangrove swamp between permaculture and spirit work. So this has been fantastic, Jack.
Great, thank you very much.
Quite a bit to play with there. I really enjoyed pushing the discussion of animism in an epistemological rather than belief-based direction, even if it means both Jack and I got an ice cream headache or two reaching for the correct words and not really finding them in our puny human language. You'll find details of Jack's latest book as well as his new podcast in the show notes. Do let me know what you think of our discussion at runesoup.com or the RuneSoup Facebook page. And if you're listening to this right away, I'm editing and uploading this in the middle of the desert, just beside Uluru, but I'll still endeavor to get your comments and responses up as quickly as possible. In the meantime, subscribe to the show in your favorite podcatcher, tell your friends, all that stuff. And apparently, even in the middle of the desert, find me on Twitter where I am Gordon, Gordon_White, WHITE. Until next time.